First, Ethiopia and the Tigray region to be specific. The headlines coming from there have been extraordinarily dire lately, with the UN warning that the people are on the edge of a humanitarian disaster. The escalating fighting with Ethiopian government troops and their allies plus an embargo has meant that more than 5 million people are desperately in need of food and medical supplies. Well, the International Committee of the Red Cross says it's taking medical supplies to the Tigrayan capital, Mekele, for the first time in 5 months. Dominik Stillhart is their Director of Operations for Africa. I asked him to confirm if the first supplies have indeed landed.
Yes, they have just landed today in Mekele. That's correct.
So what sort of supplies have you brought in?
So it's essentially medical supplies, primarily to care for war wounded. And these supplies, they've been brought into Mekele by plane from Addis.
And do you have specifics about the quantities we're talking about?
The quantities for now are relatively limited because our plane doesn't take more than perhaps 1.5 tons. But we are obviously hoping that this is just the beginning of more medical supplies going into this region in northern Ethiopia that is really in dire needs of medical supplies. You know, we have seen and heard also reports of hospitals where single-use items such as gloves, surgical material, and even chest drains are washed and reused, which obviously is heavily increasing the risk of infections. And therefore, the supplies that we have now brought in are a very positive first step in the right direction.
Was it very complicated or difficult to negotiate with the access to Mekele in terms of negotiating with the Ethiopian central authorities?
Well, our ability to respond to the huge humanitarian needs in the region have been seriously hampered by a combination of fighting, insecurity, and indeed also access constraints. But today, I'm really extremely pleased that with the support of the government in Addis, we have made it possible to have this first delivery, and obviously much more is needed. Much more is needed than that.
You say much more is needed, and you've used the words huge humanitarian needs. How would you describe the current humanitarian situation in Tigray? When we use words like dire, how would you explain that, in terms of practically what sort of crisis are we seeing that the people are affected by?
Well, first and foremost, there is considerable degrees of food insecurity. Most of the families in Tigray, they are lacking the means to have 2 or even 3 meals a day. But in addition, there is also a serious health crisis precisely because of lack of medical supplies in many of the main hospitals and health centers, because also of many health centers having been taken off service due to the conflict. And our focus right now is really to improve the health situation in the northern Ethiopia. By the way, not just in Tigray, there are other areas that have been affected seriously by this conflict in Amhara, in Afar, and these are also areas of interventions for the International Committee of the Red Cross.
Do you feel that this access that you've been giving today, even though it's small, does it give you hope in terms of confidence building that the Ethiopian government and indeed the Tigrayans themselves are ready somehow to find ways of settling this terrible dispute that they have that has led to this situation?
Well, that's a very good question, because not just in Ethiopia, everywhere else, the best way of addressing humanitarian needs is indeed a political solution, a settlement, and an end to the conflict. On our side, I think the fact that we have now been able to bring these supplies into Mekele with facilitation of the government in Ethiopia is definitely a positive sign. And I truly hope that this is the beginning of more regular supplies into this region.
And if you don't have any impediments to bringing in the supplies, how will you be bringing the bulk of the supplies, which I imagine you have, ready to help these people?
Well, the main means of bringing aid into these regions that have been affected by conflict now for months on end, obviously, is by road, because it's by road you can bring huge quantities that are needed right now. The problem was that for a very long time, these regions, they have been insecure due to conflict, and that has also hampered, of course, the work for organizations such as the International Committee of the Red Cross, the Ethiopian Red Cross, and so on and so forth. But the road is definitely the preferred way of delivering urgently required relief items into these areas that have been affected by conflict.
And do you have the supplies ready if these roads are made safe?
Yes, of course. We are ready to bring more supplies, especially in the field of health, which, as I said, is really the focus of our operations and our action and response in northern Ethiopia.
That was Dominik Stillhart, Director of Operations for Africa at the International Committee